Not all leftists are the same. Consequently, not all leftists can or should be dealt with the same when encountering them in the field. Leftists are united by a core of very wrong and dangerous ideas, but their individual manifestations can differ quite radically. Also, every leftist has a favorite cause. So, for instance, while most leftists agree that the racist, anti-poor policy of mandatory minimum wage is a good idea, not all leftists really care about that cause. And identifying that does indeed matter, because pressing a leftist on a cause that he or she or Z doesn't care about can be very useful. So, continuing the tradition of previous videos, let's go through 6 practical ways to deal with leftists in the field. Hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Freedom Alternative Research and Analysis. So, last year I made 2 videos, 5 practical ways to deal with feminists and 5 practical ways to deal with social justice warriors. Now I suggest you do watch those too, because they do treat specific subsets of leftists, while this time I'll try to be a little bit more broad with a view to build up on this and treat even more subsets in the future. One more thing before we begin, the usual fair warning: the tactics presented in this video are not meant to be complete, definitive, complementary, or mutually exclusive. They're just the result of over a decade of experience in dealing with various types of leftism and successfully combating it. Anyway, let's go through the list. Number 1 on the list: always have an audience. This is indeed common to everything I do when it comes to advocating and especially debating. Now again, the audience can be of 1 person or 1 million persons. The point is to have an audience when dealing with a leftist, because otherwise you are merely wasting your time. One should never debate alone with a leftist, regardless of the type of leftist you're dealing with. The chance of convincing the leftist of being wrong is infinitesimal and not worth the hassle. That's why the point of any discussion with the leftist is to persuade the audience and not the leftist. The focus of everything you say has to be the audience first and foremost. Now, before saying anything, always consider how that looks to the audience. Also, while we're at it, please do try, if you can of course, to find out as much as possible about the audience. For instance, is the audience economically literate or economically illiterate? Is the audience mostly young or old? Is the audience mostly male or female? Is the audience mostly formed of parents or childless people? All these aspects do matter quite a lot when debating a leftist in front of an audience. The best scenario for me, that is, when I perform the best, is not when I have an audience of right-wingers, but when I have an audience of politically ignorant individuals. You know the type, those who genuinely believe in their heart that both the left and the right are about the same thing. That is the best audience in front of which you can tear a leftist a new one. Now, why is that the case? Because that kind of audience has never been exposed to genuine non-leftist thought. That kind of audience tends to think of certain big government politicians when it thinks about the right, and then at other big government politicians when it thinks about the left. Anyway, the bottom line with this first element is to know your audience and know as many things as possible about that audience in order to steer the discussion towards the topics most likely to resonate with that audience. Alright, number 2 on the list: sources. Always use left-wing sources, or use them almost exclusively. Now, I was about to say use neutral or left-wing sources, but then I remembered that neutral sources simply do not exist. It's just that leftists rarely have the courage to admit their biases, while on the right, such disclosure is usually upfront or, at the very least, never denied. I mean, you don't see Fox News going out of its way to deny that it's a partisan center-right source, but you do see MSLSD trying really, really hard to deny that it is the propaganda mouthpiece of the darkest and the most far, far, far left of the Democrat Party. So, whenever you need to source something of what you say, try as hard as you can to use primary sources or overtly partisan left-wing sources. So, for instance, if you're discussing the migrant crisis and the vibrancy they're creating, use reporting from the left-wing media, or videos if such a thing is available, or primary sources such as the local newspaper or statistics from the relevant institution. The wrong course of action is to paste a link from Breitbart. It's not that Breitbart's reporting is wrong, but Breitbart's reporting gives you very little leeway on how to frame the issue. For instance, if you have an overtly emotional audience, Breitbart's blunt reporting does not work to your advantage. The BBC's cold and distant reporting works to your advantage because you can frame it to transmit the exact type of emotion you want. Or if you're skillful enough, you can use the hysterical far-left reporting. For instance, in the issue of migrant crisis, I routinely use the radical feminist reporting in Sweden. You know, those that blame Taharushdinsi on the alleged white cishet patriarchal system of Sweden to transmit the emotion that the left belongs in the loony bin, which it absolutely does. Point is, one has to always remember the goal, which is to persuade the audience and not the interlocutor that the left is demented. That's why left-wing sources are the best for the purpose. It saves us the work to make the case. All we have to do is point towards the mountain of insanity and describe it. Then the rest of the work is done in the minds of the audience. And that is why a politically ignorant audience is the best case scenario. Almost nobody who is not indoctrinated into the cult can look into the leftist abyss and conclude that it's a great idea. Alright, element number 3, always concede on emotion. Now, usually the strongest leftist arguments are based on emotion, because that's all the left has. One cannot genuinely believe in most of the leftist policies unless one is hooked up on an emotional guilt trip, or one is on drugs, or one has a mental disorder. The most numerous category are those on emotional guilt trips. And if you're dealing with a leftist who's been drinking this Kool-Aid for many years, it is hard to beat him or her on emotion. It is also double hard to beat him on emotion because our primary instincts as normal people is to get back to the facts, ask questions, look up into historical precedents, or bring up some sort of moral arguments. None of these work in an emotionally charged environment, which is why most non-leftists absolutely win on policy but lose on the bottom line because emotion. Case in point for this, the Obama versus Romney election. After the election, various polling companies asked the voters in an exit poll type of study various questions about the candidates, both personal and policy questions. And on the policy questions, Romney had won hands down. He had won on defense, domestic policy, foreign policy, economy, everything, but he lost overwhelmingly on emotion. On the question, which of the candidates you think cares more about you, Obama won 70-something%, and that was decisive. This is actually what Trump is doing right this time. He plays hardball on emotion. It is nasty, but that is how you win. Okay, so a few practical examples are in order because that is the easiest way to explain what I mean by always concede on emotion. Example number 1. Do you simply not care about granny so that you keep advocating for private healthcare and oppose free healthcare? Or something to that effect. The most efficient answer is something like this. Yes, of course I care. And you are, of course, right. It would be absolutely fantastic to have free healthcare. Of course I want free healthcare for Granny and for yourself and for myself and for everyone. If healthcare had been free, I would indeed have to be a huge, uncaring monster not to want it available for everyone. But the problem is that healthcare is not free. Doctors aren't free, hardware isn't free, hospitals aren't free. And while I do care about Granny getting the care she needs, I also understand, just like Granny definitely understands also, that care isn't free. If we could just print more hospitals and more doctors, that would be fabulous. But we can't. So the question is, who pays for it? Because someone has to pay for it. Or something along these lines. Basically, whatever you do or say after such an answer, the emotional guilt trip is over and the discussion will gravitate back towards the costs of healthcare and who pays for them, and not about the emotions surrounding the topic. Now, mind you, this doesn't mean you automatically win the argument. Skillful leftists will try again to drift into emotion, which is why you have to enforce the boundaries. But more on that later. Alright, example number 2. You are a xenophobe for opposing the influx of refugees. Now, I did choose the xenophobe slur because this one is at least somewhat accurate. The racist shtick is tiresome and it has gotten to a point where even the general population is viewing it with discontent. But anyway, if you're called a racist on this issue, simply retort with, "No, I'm not. You're just saying that because I'm white. You're the racist. You should be ashamed of yourself for demeaning real experiences of racism." Case closed. But when you're called a xenophobe, the charge is still emotionally strong and also harder to avoid because, after all, one of the arguments to oppose the refugees is precisely because their culture is fundamentally different from ours, which with enough skillful emotional manipulation, a topic on which leftists are indeed experts on, can be portrayed as xenophobic. Now, there is no right way of getting out from the emotional guilt trip induced by such a situation. But there are many who are definitely wrong. One of them is to get out of your way to show you're not a xenophobe. Don't do that. It puts you on the defensive and gives credence to the opponent's emotional manipulation attempt. So don't do it. One way to efficiently respond to something like this is along the following lines. For instance, I usually do that. Before splitting hairs on whether I'm a xenophobe or not, or indeed if you even understand what xenophobia actually is, let's first think about who is the hater here. We know that less than a quarter of the people that poured into Europe in the last year are from Syria. If we assume that all Syrians are refugees, that still leaves at least 800,000 people who are definitely, without a question, not refugees. 800,000 is about the population of Krakow or Amsterdam and more than the population of the financial center Frankfurt or the Scottish capital Glasgow. The Danish capital Copenhagen has 580,000 inhabitants. So you're telling me that I am a hater for saying that there is simply not enough infrastructure to support basically a new Amsterdam overnight. I think you are the hater because by insisting that everyone from everywhere should just show up here, you are condemning them to a life of extreme poverty since there is simply no way they can have even the minimal standards of living of the poorest EU state. Meanwhile, with those same resources that we'd spent just to get them idle in some godforsaken tents or sports hall in schools, we could build entire neighborhoods for them from the ground in Turkey and then provide long-term aid when their country stops fighting and help them get back on their feet. You say I'm a hater because I don't want them to be living on the streets out in the cold after walking 1,500 kilometers just to get here through the extreme heat and sun of the southern Europe and the Balkans. That's not a way to live. Even criminals deserve and indeed do get better than that, even in Yemen. If not wanting to sentence over 1 million people to such a life just so you can get warm and fuzzy in your champagne socialist circles for how compassionate you are, if that makes me a hater, then so be it. I am a hater, but at least I'm a hater with a policy that can actually work. Now, this is an actual retort that I used in a debate with an academic. Needless to say, that said academic still hates me today because the discussion was public and some of his colleagues asked him about why is he such a hater. Now, in that retort, I did multiple things at once. First, I prevented the downward spiral of emotion that is inherent when charged allegations come up. Secondly, I proposed an alternative policy that is easy to sell politically. Notice that I never said it's the position I support. That was also intentional because I don't support that position. This is another aspect at which non-leftists need a little bit of improvement. If you're not directly asked what is your position, then don't say it unless it's worth the hassle. In this particular instance, it was not worth the hassle because it would have brought new emotion, which is not something you want when trying to defuse an emotional bomb that is thrown at you. And finally, thirdly, I turned the emotional bomb back at the opponent by calling him a hater. This is something that you indeed need to learn. It's not easy, but once you master it, it's the most neat thing to do when confronted with leftist emotional bullying. Basically, I took his policy of complete and open doors for everyone and painted it as the most mean, uncaring, inhumane, poverty-inducing thing imaginable and compared it with the most tame version of non-leftist policies. This is something you should always strive to do. Almost always there is a case to be made that leftist policies are not just yielding poor results, but are downright mean and hateful. Now, to cold-hearted shitlords like me, that's irrelevant, but it is relevant to the general public, and it is a mistake not to use that when arguing in front of an audience. Anyway, let's go. Oh my god. We spent so much time on this element. Well, we kind of had to because emotion is the strongest leftist weapon and indeed the hardest to counteract. So, element number 4, enforce the lines. Now, as I said, it is not only preferable but morally right for the leftist to always be on the defensive. This can be achieved fairly easy at the early stages of the debate when you impose your own framing of the issue which compels the opponent to be on the defensive. Besides, on almost every issue, it is the case that the leftist position is the establishment. So, of course, the establishment has to defend its own policies and its own status. The thing with the left is, though, the fact that they're usually poor on logic. Even the brightest leftists out there, and there are quite a few very, very bright leftists out there, even those are usually very poor on logic, and that's because most of their convictions come from emotion rather than reason. And this is not me mocking them, it's just a simple acknowledgement. I mean, I do understand them. It does feel good to be a leftist. It provides easy answers, and you don't really have to check whether those easy answers work or not. This sentiment is significantly augmented in leftist academics who tend to live in a completely isolated bubble, and combined with their elitist sentiment, which is rarely earned or deserved, but that's a different story, it is easy to see why they end up being leftists in the first place. Right-wingers, on the other hand, have to tone down the emotion quite a lot and face the cold hard truth that the world is not only is not perfect, but it can never be perfect. You know, the tragic vision. Anyway, because of this aspect, leftists will do their best to go rogue and move the goalposts, especially if you've diffused the emotional bombs and shifted the discussions on issue that he doesn't master, but the audience wants to hear. When that happens, and it almost always happens if the discussion is long enough, it is on you to insist on staying on point. One example is when you're discussing taxes. I mean, as a non-leftist, the best framing of the issue is to put it in terms of a normal family of four, two parents and two children, and just build up from there. If you do that, it is very hard for the leftists to consistently and convincingly defend the absolutely appalling state of modern Europe, where such a family pays at least 55% of its income to the state, even if that family is near the poverty line. However, that line is defended, and more on that in this video if you're curious on how to look at poverty. So, given that the situation is unassailable, the leftists will try to move the goalposts. Now, there are multiple ways to do that at the leftists' disposal, depending on where you are or what area you're having under consideration. But most of the time, they go for the low-hanging fruit and bring race into discussion. You know what to do? Don't let them do that. And I say this not because you cannot win the extended argument that includes race, but because you're allowing yourself into a downward spiral of chasing ghosts, because once he can do that once, he'll do it multiple times during a discussion. So basically, when that happens, simply insist, no, don't move the goalposts, we're discussing taxes, not racism and not race-specific problems, but taxes, which, last time I checked, aren't charged differently based on race, so please stay on topic. We can discuss race afterwards if you really want that, but now let's finish the taxes point. So, you were saying, and then just repeat the last point and compel the interlocutor to continue from there. Alright, let's go further to avoid turning this video into a full-featured lecture. Element number 5, the use of satire and mocking. Now, this one is a lot harder than it would seem, especially against a general-purpose leftist. I mean, it is easier with certain types of leftists, like feminists, social justice warriors, or eco-Marxists. After all, mocking ridiculous beliefs such as the patriarchy conspiracy theory, the white privilege conspiracy theory, or the flat-out insanity that green energy can save the economy, it's easy to use satire on those. However, it is a lot harder to use satire on a Jeremy Corbyn type of leftist, or a François Mitterrand type of leftist, for those of you who remember him. In addition to being difficult to use on certain type of leftists, satire and mocking also needs the perfect timing and the perfect conditions to occur in order for it to be effective. And this requires skill in identifying that moment should it occur, because some debates simply do not end up in a moment when satire or mocking is appropriate. Also, the appropriateness of satire is audience dependent. I mean, some audiences don't react well to satire, in which case you should not use it even if you do have the opportunity. And finally, there's also the issue of how versed your audience is. For instance, mocking a Corbynite for being BFFs with Hamas only works if your audience knows what Hamas is. So, with all those caveats being said, let's give a couple of examples. Example 1. For instance, when debating the worthiness of the European Union and you're served with an accusation of xenophobia and of hating the poor for wanting to secede the European Union, or for wanting sweeping and fundamentally transformative reforms, or simply for criticizing the European Union, one way to mock such an argument is to use Greece as an example. Like this. Yes, I am indeed very xenophobic and obviously hate the poor, because we all know that it is my and the conservatives' fault in general that a significant minority of people in Greece are eating from the trash can these days, when they could have had a devalued currency and climbed back to prosperity. And we all know that it's obviously the conservatives' fault that Greeks can't access their own money. It's not like a government led by the coalition of the far left at the behest of the EU introduced cash control or something. Heaven forbid. The EU is God on earth and can do no wrong. It's only those pesky conservatives who dare to oppose progress. And I'm obviously xenophobic because it sure is my fault, or the conservatives' fault in general, that a hard-working American immigrant has to jump through a crap ton of hoops to get legal status in the EU, whilst vibrant welfare diversity from the Middle East just has to show up and maintain a body temperature around 36.6 degrees in Celsius. Such a retort, or of course you can make it shorter or longer depending on the format of the debate, but such a retort not only mocks the original argument but also highlights the inherent inconsistencies between the official story about the greatness of the EU and the EU in practice. Now, as I said, it's not easy to do and it does require a tremendous amount of knowledge. For instance, very few Europeans, even those who are engaged in political thought of some kind, are even aware how hard it is for our friends and allies in the United States to even travel from one EU state to the other, let alone get temporary residence longer than 90 days. Example number 2. Let's say you're discussing how the police conducts its business in, let's say, Sweden. I have actually been served with the argument that the police in Sweden doesn't do enough to catch and deliver for prosecution those who commit acts of internet hate or revenge porn. Now, I've reconstructed from memory the mocking that I served at the time, though I did add a bit more. So, the mocking way to respond to such an argument goes something along these lines. Yes, the police should do more because that's indeed the national emergency. Some broad who forgot to turn off her webcam and the video ended up online. Such a horror indeed. Forget about the hundreds of girls assaulted at music festivals by the vibrant diversity and covered up by the police. Forget about guarding the borders. Revenge porn is by far the biggest problem of the nation. It's interesting to observe the priorities of the Swedish left. The left is all about legalizing drugs, yet Sweden has drug laws that make the United States war on drugs look tame in comparison. You never hear the left whining about that. The left is also all about environmental causes and the Earth Hour and all of that nonsense, but when the police has to forcibly cancel eco-Marxist events to prevent further escalation of sexual violence, the left is lashing out against the police, which goes again to show that the vibrant diversity trumps everything else, including protecting the physical integrity of women or the individual freedoms of individuals to consume whatever they damn please, causes which otherwise the left boasts about when it comes to scoring points with conservatives. But no, let's not talk about all those because we have real horrors to tackle. Revenge porn. Now, in this particular example, I simply applied the compared to what question in the Thomas Sowell test. Is revenge porn an issue? Maybe. Personally, I don't think it is an issue at all, but even if you do think it is, there is no question that under the current climate, it's nowhere near the top 5 issues that the police should deal with immediately. Regardless of your opinion, zooming out from the issue, revenge porn in this case, but it does apply to any petty small thing that may be brought up by the leftist in the discussion, zooming out from the issue is a good strategy if you intend to mock. Zooming out is a good strategy in general because it puts things into the proper context and it almost always works with almost all types of audience, for the simple reason that the underlying assumption of this tactic is commonsensical even amongst most leftists, namely the assumption that there is indeed a hierarchy of issues, that there are indeed issues that are far more important than others. This to conservatives and to non-leftists in general, this is self-evident because we know that we have unlimited needs and limited resources. So prioritizing is pretty much a foregone conclusion. But to leftists, this is not so obvious. But their underlying subconsciousness does the job, however, for them. Reality has a capitalist bias. Anyway, last but not least, element number 6, humanize the issue. Now, again, this doesn't always work since it is audience dependent. There are two ways to humanize the issue: through an inspirational story or through a sob story. If your story is inspirational, you need to be very careful because this is an emotional bomb that can backfire if not delivered correctly. If your audience is mostly young, particularly young men, then the inspirational story is definitely the way to go. If your audience, however, is mostly mothers or people over the age of 45, then the sob story is the way to go. This is a tactic that the left has been using for decades, and most of the time successfully, even with outright false stories. One of the few times they failed was when the story was not only false, but way too egregious even for many leftists. And I'm talking here about the Jackie story and the alleged gang rape at UVA. The most successful episode of this tactic was in 2009 in the American Congress, when Obama brought in there an old lady and made her the face of the disastrous Affordable Care Act and used her story to promote his policy. And it worked. Most congressmen bought the Kool-Aid because the story was delivered almost impeccably with the exact dosage of emotion, facts, and lies by omission. Another successful episode of this tactic is the dead Syrian boy picture, framed impeccably by the cathedral media, which managed to maintain for a brief period of time, but enough period of time also, the utterly false narrative that refusing to allow over 1 million unvetted migrants into Europe is evil because it would lead to more Syrian kids dead on the shores of the Mediterranean. The exact dosage of emotion, facts, and lies by omission. One of the huge omissions of that story was, of course, the fact that the boy had died because of the extreme greed of his parents, since the kid and his parents were already safe and well fed and housed in Turkey. But instead of working with that, they decided to break all the laws and common sense to attempt to reach Germany at all costs, including the cost of their son's life. Thanks to impeccable framing and emotional manipulation, a banal story of negligent manslaughter was turned into the story to open the floodgates to endless, vibrant diversity. Now, I'm not saying you should do the same, but I am saying that it is about bloody time we start humanizing issues as well. Just put a face on it. The only time non-leftists did that somewhat successfully on a comparable scale was with Joe the plumber, to whom Obama said he'll take his wealth and spread it around. The framing of that video created a strong enough emotion into enough people to give birth to the Tea Party movement. I say somewhat successfully because too many non-leftists stood out from that round or downplayed it with smug utterances of, "Yeah, we know Obama is a socialist, so what?" Thus showing that they don't understand practical boots-on-the-ground politics for hearts and minds. That moment could have been exploited to a much larger extent. But anyway, that's a story for another day. Okay, so how do you humanize an issue? Well, it does require, let's face it, a bit of luck. You actually need to find or know a good enough poster case for the point you're trying to make. That's why this tactic is not very useful for those who are just now beginning to confront leftism, but rather useful for those who are more mature. And by mature, I don't necessarily mean old, but rather experienced in this. And you'd be surprised how many very experienced young people are out there doing fabulous agitprop for non-leftist causes. Anyway, real-life example that I use in various arguments with leftists, Mrs. Doina Cepalis. Doina Cepalis is a very, very strong and resilient businesswoman from Pașcani, northeastern Romania. She did something that most politicians would say it's impossible: play against the Chinese on European rules and win. And not just win, but win so conclusively to the point where the Chinese are importing the products from her factory and the Chinese have completely withdrawn from some of the European markets because of her. And she did that during a time of economic crisis. Her business grew 500% in 2009, a time when most businesses in Europe were aiming at survival and many more, especially factories, were suspending or completely shutting down their activity. Now, she has 6 factories all over the Northeast, over 1,000 employees, and is almost always an uncontested European leader on her business niche. Her biggest problem? Taxes and regulations. Not the patriarchy, not misogyny, not oppression, not chauvinism, not xenophobia, nothing. But taxes and especially regulations. Now, I tried to find a few links in English too, but she's not so keen on interviews in general because, she has work to do. Now, her story is very good as an inspirational story and useful in many situations. I used her example successfully when I was served with claims of sexism in business, economically illiterate claims about the economic system in this country, or claims that regulations are good. You see, when she did what she did was possible here and not possible in France or the United Kingdom, and not because of the labor costs, but because regulations in France make it impossible to manufacture her product at a convenient enough cost. Heck, her biggest client was at one moment a big French conglomerate which had tried itself to manufacture it in France and failed, even though it had much more money than she had when they attempted to do it. That is, of course, just one example. I could actually spend an hour providing various examples, but this video is already getting too long, so I'll stop here. So, one more time. I do not claim to have all the answers, nor do I claim that my methods are definitive or even the best. They're just the best of the methods that I have tried myself and have worked. As I was saying in the intro, not all leftists are the same, so not all methods work in all situations. The point of this video is to provide at least some guidelines in case some of you would like to start confronting leftists in a smart way and actually contribute to forwarding the non-leftist thought. Another important aspect to bear in mind is to set realistic goals. Like, for instance, change one mind in every 6 months. This is a goal that anyone can realistically achieve. If you set out to utterly humiliate your opponent with your wit and change 10 minds in the next 2 weeks, you'll probably fail for the simple reason that you've set a highly unrealistic goal. Besides, humiliating your opponent should never be the goal. Now, of course, if the opportunity somehow presents itself during a debate, then yeah, sure, you should take it, but it should never be your goal. Being overconfident usually works against you when trying to convince your audience that your opponent is wrong. It is better to approach it with a bit of wit, but otherwise with a healthy dose of humility. Starting from such a position allows you to play your opponent's hubris against him, and that is usually what pisses your opponent off. And pissing your opponent does at least 50% of the job, because a pissed off leftist is bound to lose even the small traces of rationality that might have existed in him. And when that happens, your job is done. Nobody likes a whiny bully who thinks he's right but can't even get the facts straight. Anyway, with that being said, thank you all for your continuous support. Thank you for watching, and I guess I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.